Okay, this is a talk that I gave in February of 2015, focusing on madness, unusual experiences, distress, and their representation in films. I originally gave it at this event called Perceptions of Madness at the LSE Literature Festival, with quite an interesting panel of Sarah Carr, who was a service user consultant and an actual cinephile, unlike myself, Paul Farmer of Mind, and the novelist Nathan Filer. The audio and video of us talking about this, though not our slides, is available on the LSE website, and because of the absence of slides, that's why I'm recording the talk in this way. Now, I started out this talk by just finding, off the top of my head, just a bunch of different representations of unusual experience, distress, what might be called madness or mental illness in films. This ranges from, well, comparatively mild. Up in the top left-hand corner is Robert De Niro in The King of Comedy, engages in kidnapping. But there's also a range of other films. Natalie Portman's there, Jack Nicholson, Kevin Spacey. Various representations of madness in film. And for the purposes of the talk, I broke these down into two broad categories. Now, the first one was where madness or distress or unusual experience is equated to badness. So, as a kidnapper, there we've got Jack Nicholson in The Shining. Below that, Anthony Perkins in Psycho, which possibly the definitive depiction of kind of bad psycho killer. Though Kevin Spacey, also I think in Seven, encapsulates that. And down in the bottom left-hand corner we have Kathy Bates in Misery, who engages in some fairly terrible behaviours. Misery from 1990. Now, there may be many other films you can think of that fall into these categories. Even when I was rehearsing this talk, people came up with a few suggestions. I couldn't quite cram them all onto the one slide. Now, I'm not going to talk about madness equaling badness today. That's been something that's been discussed extensively, I think, in the past, and even on the night when I was talking about this at the London School of Economics, Paul Farmer of Mind talked a bit about these kinds of representations and was offering a description of the Mind Media Code for dramas and soap operas as an alternative to this. And the kind of primary alternative that he was proposing, and I think other people have proposed, is a sense of, madness or distress as sickness. The idea that people are troubled, distressed, suffering in some way. So we have David Lynch's Eraserhead there, and Black Narcissus, Powell and Pressburger film, and Natalie Portman in Black Swan. Amadeus down at the bottom there with Mozart descending into madness. A film about split personalities with Joanne Woodward, and right down in the bottom right hand corner we have Nigel Hawthorne in The Madness of King George, which I think does have some kind of compassion within it, and I think is a representation of a sort of early idea of unusual experience being sickness or a state outside of the norm. There are certainly a bunch of quite entertaining doctors within that film. However, the film that I'm going to focus on is the one up in the top centre, which is this film. Now, this is a film which many people may recognise. It was very popular 2 or 3 years ago. 2012, I think the release was. And for those of you with reasonable memories, you'll know that it was called Silver Linings Playbook. And it is perhaps not the greatest film ever. I enjoyed it, but it was a real Hollywood movie. However, it did attract a huge amount of comment over the period of time. Jennifer Lawrence, the woman pictured, won an Oscar for her performance, and much of the comment was focused on its representation of mental health issues. And in many quarters, it was considered to be a good depiction. There's a couple of quotes here. A nice job of depicting the manic depressive illness, or also about real mental illness, which it portrays with unusual empathy. Both of those quotes are from psychiatrists, so both of those quotes are from mental health professionals. Incidentally, the older man pictured in this still from the film. Plays a psychiatrist, possibly the most unusual psychiatrist I've ever seen depicted in any dramatic representation, as at one point he gets into a football riot with the main character. So slightly eccentric psychiatrist there. Okay, now in this good depiction, the younger man in that frame, Bradley Cooper, plays a character called Pat. His father, who's opposite him, is played by Robert De Niro again, really hamming it up in this film. And he's kind of an unsympathetic character. We initially find him in a psychiatric facility whence he has gone for effectively attacking a man whom he found in flagrante with his wife. So he's not a terribly sympathetic character, and generally speaking, I think he's played extremely well actually. As a guy he's maybe a bit hard to warm to, certainly in the beginning of the film. However, I think what's key about this film is that he is explicitly offered to us as being mentally ill. He's characterised as having bipolar disorder. That's also the reason why he's in a psychiatric facility. And his illness opens up our compassion. The notion of him, his behaviour and his experiences being defined as an illness opens up our compassion for him. And it seems to me that this is a very contemporary view of mental health in drama, something that's really quite relevant to our current cultural moment, for want of a better way of putting it. Now, I think that this contemporary nature of mad now equaling sick is very significant right now, because what we use it for is not blaming people. So the character within the film, Pat, is not blamed for the difficulties that he offered us. He's seen as sick, and that in some way is a different way of viewing him, a less angry, less blaming way of viewing him. Now, I think when you start looking for this idea of sickness being a way of not blaming people for things that are going on for them, you don't have to look very far. A quick Google search around, for example, mental health problems and being one's own fault, or one being weak or something like that, you'll find a lot of repudiation of this. A slightly more direct version of that from Alistair Campbell. Now, this was a quote on Twitter when Alistair Campbell was responding to some rather negative statements about Stephen Fry. Now, Stephen Fry a few years ago had admitted to some suicidal feelings, and evidently there was a bit of stuff going around saying, what's he got to be depressed about? He's, clever and well off and successful. And Alistair Campbell responded to this, saying, to those who are asking what Stephen Fry has to be depressed about, would you ask what someone has to be cancerous, diabetic, or asthmatic about? So the sense that why shouldn't he be depressed? It's kind of a sickness like any other. You wouldn't ask somebody who had cancer what they had to be cancerous about. And I think that's a very powerful narrative at the moment, and it's something that has gone very much to the heart of anti-stigma messages around mental health. We hear quite a lot about mental health stigma at the moment. The Time to Change campaign is an umbrella organisation of several charities and organisations set up to combat stigma around mental health. And one of their central planks is that mental health problems are, as their website puts it, as real as a broken arm. So there's nothing to be ashamed of. These are illnesses like any other. Now, I think that there are different ways that you can view distressing experience or unusual experiences, and sickness is certainly one way. And I do feel that there are a number of upsides. I don't want to minimise that there are a number of upsides to such views. One upside, I give a longer talk about this, and one of the examples I use is an early example of this is shell shock in the First World War. I think it was a huge advance that people were eventually seen as having a trauma in a more formal way, rather than being cowardly or being sent white feathers or whatever happened at that point in history. Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy of books is, I think, very interesting about this. I do feel that the notion of that people are, traumatized in some ways is a really big step forward in terms of opening up a compassionate response. Also, illnesses may lead to treatment with medication. I'm certainly not down on medication at all. I think it has its place. You do read articles from time to time that are very anti-medication, arguing that it should be taken out of psychiatry and mental health completely. I wouldn't subscribe to those views. I do think there's another interesting conversation to be had about what medication actually does. A psychiatrist called Joanna Moncrief has argued quite strongly that medication doesn't necessarily fix specific biological imbalances in your brain, but may have more general effects that can be beneficial. There may be downsides to medication as well, but for many people, I think it may not feel terribly optional. There's also the importance of psychotherapies and talking therapies, things that are increasingly part of the picture in the health service and outside it as a response to emotional difficulties and what we might call mental illnesses. Now, I think something that gets neglected also in talking about the upside of a sick label or feeling that you're sick is that it can have a hugely validating experience. It can be a hugely validating experience for people, and it may be the only thing sometimes for people that can capture what is really going on. A colleague of mine who leads in our service user side talks about this very passionately and very eloquently, that really the notion that there was something wrong with her brain, that she was ill, was really the only thing that captured the strangeness, the oddity of what was going on when she was having some unusual and extremely distressing experiences. The picture that just popped up there is a book called My Schizophrenic Life, which is part of a broader move of literature from people who've experienced mental health problems. There's been a real explosion of this kind of literature in the last few years, partly due to Kindle books and things like that. But I think that my overall point here is that it is or can be extremely validating for people in terms of making sense of their experience. Now, also something that I don't want to minimise is the idea that a sick label actually is something that can access benefits. You can come off work. You can't get a day off work for being sad. You can get a day off work for being sick. Now, whether that's right or not, it's a whole other question, but that's the way things are, and I do think it's important that we can see our difficulties in terms of sickness for those sorts of purposes as well. However, I think there are downsides of seeing experience such as sadness, such as anxiety, perhaps even such as strange perceptual experiences under the rubric of sickness or illness or mental health. And myself and colleagues have talked about these, written about these things extensively elsewhere, and I'll give a list of, I think, some interesting authors who talk about these things at the end of the talk. But I think that there are a number of broad downsides which are very worth pointing out. A lot of the debates around these things came to the fore in 2013 when this book here, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was published. Now, this attracted quite a lot of media coverage. Perhaps you saw some of it. It was the fifth version of the primary American psychiatric classification manual. In Europe, the official psychiatric classification manual is the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, which is published by the World Health Organization. But some of the concerns about the DSM, and I think this picture on the right is an attempt to illustrate that, is that it has become larger and larger with every edition since the 1950s. It started in the 1950s, and the book has become bigger and bigger, and thus encompassed a greater and greater range of human experience within it under the umbrella of illness. Now, this increased scope has raised concern, and not just from people who are, whom you would expect to be concerned about, or you expect to be opposed to seeing things as mental illnesses, and there are indeed a number of authors and advocates who are in that position. But right across the board, the increased scope of this manual raised some concern. Somebody called Alan Francis, the editor of DSM-4, the previous edition, said that the publication of version 5 was a sad day for psychiatry. And again, the root of his concerns were, does this new manual over-pathologise human behaviour? Are there things in it that would perhaps be better just seen as parts of normal life rather than sicknesses? And there were all sorts of articles floating around at the time. This one from Slate.com was not untypical. Abnormal is the new normal. Why half the US population will have a diagnosable mental disorder. So the idea being that, the concern being that a lot of life was beginning to be subsumed within, under the umbrella, under the rubric of mental illness. Now, you may feel, well, why not? It's important to respond to things. It's important to be able to address them, capture them, deal with things in the best way that we can. But there are also some very, very significant downsides, I think, to sickness labels for emotional and psychological states. The first one concerns reliability, what's normally termed reliability, which is the idea that do experts agree? Do they agree that they're looking at depression or anxiety or schizophrenia or whatever it may be? And historically, agreement hasn't been all that great. Certainly not as good as in physical health, not even close. And there does seem to be some evidence that it's improving, but it may be that professionals don't agree quite as much as we would like to think that they do about what they're looking at. A second big concern, and this has gone through a number of different fields, is the idea that there aren't consistent, or it's difficult to find consistent biological underpinnings for these syndromes and states that are described in the main classification schemes. Indeed, the National Institute of Mental Health in the USA withdrew their funding from research using the DSM categories because they felt that they weren't sufficiently grounded, or they weren't grounded in clear neurological substrates or clear neurological bases for these illnesses. So again, there is, I think, a fairly significant deviation from physical health here, in the sense that they don't seem to be as valid as a lot of physical health categories. However, I think that when you put those things together, what you're left with also are worries about a certain subjectivity over mental health diagnoses. And the example that's often quoted here is that of homosexuality, which was in the DSM until the 1980s, rather surprisingly, in one form or another. It was taken out then, but the notion that certainly some years ago it was seen as a mental illness, homosexuality was seen as a mental illness. Now, social consensus have changed since then, and while you may find some people who still see it that way, I would suggest it's not the majority opinion, and it certainly has come out of the DSM, and it's no longer seen as a mental illness. Obviously, I would say that's a very, very good thing. There have been other things which have been classed as mental illnesses, which I think we would have some, shall we say, subjective disagreement with. This one, not in the classification schemes I'm talking about, is drapetomania, a psychiatric diagnosis, runaway slave syndrome. Why else would slaves wish to run away? This was in the 19th century. Why else would slaves wish to run away? They must be mentally ill. And the guy is a doctor. The inventor of the syndrome is a doctor, so we know that we can trust him. Okay, now, leaving aside the subjectivity of these things and concerns over the neurological basis of them, I think that perhaps my own overweening concern in these regards is, are they useful? Are they a useful way of seeing things? And I have suggested that there are a number of different ways in which I think they are useful, despite these reservations illustrated by these three pictures. However, a colleague of mine, with whom I give a kind of longer version of some of the material in this talk, Anne Cook, does say, well, they may make people more sympathetic towards you, but is "I have schizophrenia" a good chat-up line? Is it? Really, people may feel more sympathetic or less blaming, but are there still negative associations inherent in having a mental health diagnosis? So the question is, how useful are mental health diagnoses in these kind of respects? And there certainly does seem to be evidence that they are associated with many negative perceptions of those labelled. There are, in fact, my colleague Anne would go so far as, I think, to suggest that some of the negative associations are inherent, and they are associated with just having a diagnosis, and that people may take a negative view of this when you receive such a diagnosis, and that stigma isn't really going away. Also internally, a sense, when you look through certain areas of service user literature, you will find accounts that receiving a diagnosis confirmed a sense of hopelessness, or a negative view of self, or feeling defective, a view of seeing one's personality, one's abilities in a very, very negative light, or a worry that there was something unfixably wrong with you. A sense, could you ever get rid of your diagnostic label? Now, all of these issues are discussed at much greater length elsewhere, and as I say, I've given a list of some authors I think are interesting in these respects on the final slide. I think it's also worth pointing out something about, certainly in Britain, our current state of play with mental health diagnosis means that you can be treated against your will, even if you're deemed to have capacity. Now, that's a whole other talk by itself, but I don't want to let it go on this one, because I think it is an interesting one, and the rights and wrongs of that. There are things to be said on all sides of that, but you can be treated against your will. And also, I think, for me, perhaps the main issue is that I do wonder if it takes us to a place where we start to look inside of people's heads. Now, this slide here from Matt Groening's Futurama, it says something about, I'm not sure if everything sucks because I'm depressed, or I'm depressed because everything sucks. Is the problem inside me or outside me? And if you think about that, I think that's quite a profound conundrum. So when you're looking outside of people, there's a lot going on. If you're looking inside their heads, what happens to life events which, may be strongly related to mental health problems? Things like divorce, unemployment, loneliness, homelessness, poverty. Many of these things are strongly linked to mental health outcomes, and if we're just looking inside people's heads, I think with the best will in the world, when we're diagnosing people and looking at the problems inside them, I think our view gets turned away from things outside of them, and that seems to me to be quite a significant concern with such labels. So, I'm not sure if everything sucks because I'm depressed, or I'm depressed because everything sucks. It's a big conundrum. Okay, so are the downsides of mental health diagnosis represented in film? I'm not so sure they are. You may have other examples. Now, this is still from a famous film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from the 1970s, Jack Nicholson again. And this film seems to me to be very grounded in what would have been known as the anti-psychiatry movement in those days. People like R.D. Laing, Thomas Saz, the notion that the system was in some ways the thing at fault, the psychiatric system was the thing at fault. And certainly within this, Jack Nicholson plays a man who's got himself moved from prison into a psychiatric facility, and the depiction of the psychiatric facility is absolutely without compassion, really. The idea that the picture here, Nurse Ratched, is a celebrated film villain, and she's this is the main representative of the psychiatric system within the film, and she's seen as being cruel and persecutory, as is the overall system. Electroconvulsive therapy is used within the film. That's very much still with us. Psychosurgery, neurological surgery, which is not really with us anymore. Detention. All of these things are within the film, and I wouldn't go as far as, I've worked in the psychiatric system plenty, and I've not found it to be anything like this persecutory. Though of course some people may have experienced it as so. But I suppose this is the primary film depiction, certainly that strikes me, where there is a notion of questioning that who's sick. Is it the system, or is it the people who are kind of being crushed by the system? Now there may be broader social resonances in that as well. Okay, so let's head back to Silver Linings Playbook again before finishing. Silver Linings Playbook initially seems to be quite an illness positive film, and one where the main character, as I say, is sympathised with due to his illness. However, I think it is a little bit more subversive than that. Pat, the main character, is actually shown rebelling, and he's shown in a very slight echo of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He's shown not taking his meds. He kind of palms his medication and doesn't take it. So the question is, how does he recover? And for those of you who haven't seen the film, I'm afraid I'm going to spoil it now. He recovers via a dance contest at the end. He enters a dance contest at the end of the film, and he's saved partly by that, partly by true love. And I told you it was a Hollywood film. He's saved by the love of a good woman, which you don't really get much more Hollywood than that. And in some sense, the film does give a slightly different message. He's not saved by medicine; he's saved by love. Now, are we ready for a film about people being saved by medicine? I think possibly with heart surgery or something like that, we would be fine with that. Are we ready for that with psychiatry? I don't think so. And I think the fact that we might not be ready for that kind of story is worth thinking about. Okay, so where does this leave us with the idea of madness? I think the idea of illness is dominant, I think, not just in films, but in other cultural products as well. And that does have its advantages. I also think it has serious limitations and problems, some of which I've tried to make clear. I think for me the biggest danger of all is of seeing things only through that lens. I certainly have colleagues and other people I know who are very much more negative about the idea of illness. For me, I think the primary problem is seeing difficulties only through that lens. Now, this is a complicated issue, and it prompts passionate debate, probably more passionate debate than anything I have ever encountered within in my time in working in mental health, and one could be excused sometimes for feeling a bit like that. Okay, so to finish off, just for further information, I've got a talk with my colleague Anne Cook, which is available from that link. The talk is termed "Is Life a Disease?" You can just Google that, and that, I think, is an attempt to go through some of the pros and cons of psychiatric diagnosis, mental health diagnosis, and hopefully in a reasonably balanced way. Now, I think that some of the following authors, Mary Boyle, Richard Bentle, Joanna Moncrief, David Pilgrim, Rufus May, Flo Bellamy, Joe Hemmingfield, all of these people have written and spoken very interestingly. Some of these people have a service user background, some are psychologists, some psychiatrists, and I think they all have interesting things to say, and slightly different degrees of discomfort with psychiatric diagnosis, but I do recommend following up some of the names some of the names on that list if you're interested in finding out any more. So thanks very much.